I mean, you are a professor of philosophy at the City College of New York. You are the president of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. And the way in which I met you was with the wonderful Plato, not Prozac. I, yeah, still feel affectionate to that book because it was the way in which I realized that, oh, wow, philosophy can actually do something for people. At the time, you know, I was doing my PhD. I was wrapped up in very difficult theoretical concepts. It was beautiful. I loved it. But I felt the lack of, yeah, what do I do with this in life? And then I met your book. And then after your book, I found a way to reach you. And then I discovered that you're also the founder of the APA Association. So you actually train philosophers, people to do philosophical counseling. And I never thank you enough for that because, yeah, you gave a shape to a passion of mine. I
Well, that's
have to say
great.
this.
That's great. So there's no contradiction, as you well understand. One can study what I call theoretical philosophy,
Right.
and it's very beautiful. It's extremely deep. It's not for everybody. It's for those who enjoy and appreciate that kind of work. And we're a small population all overall.
Right.
Philosophy departments are very very small, but that usually the quality is very large. But there's no contradiction between doing that and applying philosophy to everyday life, helping people to be philosophical, as you well understand, at whatever level, whatever depth suits them. Everybody's different, and they really need to discover what kind of philosopher they are to
Yeah.
help to make their way through life. So yeah, we've been doing this now. APA has been engaged in this training of philosophers to be useful, as we like to call it, for it's now 23 years, and we've been training. You know,
Wow.
it's just taking off. This last year, it took off in India. It's previous to that in China. Now it's taking off in Russia, and we've helped many pioneers in their own countries to go back and to further the growth of the movement. You know, we've had international conferences. We have a new website now, which has all the history of the movement from 1994 right to the present on the international conferences, who's organized them, the programs, the speakers, the links. So it's a very interesting way, as you understand, to continue our lives in both spheres, the intellectual sphere of the university and also the public sector, where ordinary people are trying to find their way through life, and sometimes philosophy is very helpful for them, as you obviously know.
I totally agree. How would you define philosophical counseling? What's your experience of it? What can we say about it?
Well, we have to say importantly, because especially in the United States, where everybody is very psychologized. No offense to psychologists, but they have a very big presence on the landscape here, have
Mhm.
had for many decades. So the first thing to be said is that they don't own the word counseling. Some of them think they do, but there are marriage counselors and debt counselors and vocational counselors and every possible kind of counselor. And if you go back to Seneca, it's
Yeah.
several centuries,
Yeah.
and we go back to letters from a Stoic, we'll find, I think it's letter 41, letter 40 something, 47 maybe, where someone says, what is philosophy? What's the purpose? And Seneca says, the purpose of philosophy only has one purpose. He says, counsel.
Uh, uh,
So from the mouth of Seneca, a great Roman Stoic, and the idea is to give counsel, to give advice, to give suggestions. When people can't find their own way, sometimes they need to consult someone. But the very first thing to say, even before that, is that we're an educational activity. We're obviously not a medical activity, and we're also not a psychological activity. We're not diagnosing anything we're not trained to, we don't want to. It's important for people to know this, Susie, because sure, sometimes there's something wrong, and then you have to figure out what's wrong. You have to have a diagnosis, a treatment. So if you have a medical problem, you seek a diagnosis and a treatment. If you have a psychological problem, you can seek a diagnosis and a treatment. It's not quite the same. but it's more harnessed to that model.
Mhm.
But if you have a philosophical problem, then you're not going to discover what's wrong with you. You're going to discover what's right with you, because that's the other part of the human being which is
Yeah,
not being addressed. What resources do you have that
yeah,
can be mobilized? What important things are you thinking that you don't have a context for in the history of ideas? Who's your inner philosopher? Who's guiding you when you're
mhm,
not on the phone? When you're not on your cell phone, you have to be in touch with that. And in many cases, the inner philosopher is dormant. So
mhm,
our job, it's like really Plato's model of the midwife. We have to wake up the
mhm.
inner philosopher in our clients, and then they're fine. So it's not psychotherapy.
No.
Certainly not. It's an educational activity, and it's an inquiry, as you know.
Do you have any episode of awakening that is particularly dear to you, of having awake a dormant philosopher in any of your clients, and it was a satisfaction for
Well, you
both?
see it happening, and it's this model. I didn't invent this idea. For a long time, I had other conceptions, and still do, because each client is different, right? We don't have a model. Thank goodness for shoehorning everybody in. Everybody
Mhm,
gets cut in. Fits into this box. No, we have many ways, Eastern, Western, in between. But the idea of the inner philosopher came to me when I met a great Japanese Buddhist leader, Daisaku Ikeda.
mhm,
And they had Plato and Prozac in Japan, and he became aware of it. So, having been invited to meet with him, he understood better than we did, in some sense, what we were doing. So, viewed from a Buddhist perspective, we're definitely helping people to awaken. And this can be understood from a Mahayana perspective as a kind
mhm.
of bodhisattva practice. So we're really wanting to help people to wake up. I mean, that's a Buddhist picture anyway, that most of us are sleeping in one way, even wide awake. We're
Mhm.
somnambulating through life. And the idea is to become more aware, more conscious, more connected, more compassionate, more, just overall to wake up and utilize the power of the mind. So that's Plato also, in a way. So if you look back through the lens of Buddhism, if you look back at the Greeks, this is a way in which they're considered to be on a bodhisattva path. So if we model ourselves after the Socratic enterprise, and that kind of mission, then Buddhists see us as, in a way, kindred spirits. Although we're not espousing a religion, we're not trying to proselytize. But that was a revelation to me, and the reason is, Susie, I'll be brief, but the reason is that in the end, most of my clients, when they're ready to be, their own philosophers, they always say the most important words. It's not the counselor who says something to the client, which is the big important insight. It's the client who will come out with something totally brilliant, and then they themselves hear it and say, this is the aha moment.
Uh-huh.
But it's not us. We're not the ones who provide the great interpretation of the dream or the brilliant. Sometimes of course we give them good ideas, but they're the ones, when they wake up, whose voice is the voice of their inner philosopher, and that's always a very satisfying moment.
Yeah, it's a very enriching job. You learn from them, they learn from you. It's an ongoing exchange and a meiotic process,
Mayudic, that's right.
yeah,
That's what it
as you
is.
were saying. And look, I mean, I know that you're an expert also in Asian philosophy, in Eastern philosophy. And something that I saw often is that Western philosophy is considered more or less useless when we need some kind of help, and people tend to look at Eastern philosophy to nurture the spirit. What do you think? Is there a bridge we can build there, or Western philosophy is too difficult to reach? There's a big gap. What do you think?
Well, if people find what they're looking for, I mean, if you want to look for gaps, you find gaps. If you want to look for bridges, you find bridges. In my own experience, I don't see much that's really different in the human being. we have in the great civilizations of the world and in the great philosophies that they engender all kinds of different perspectives, and some of the debates that Western philosophers have been engaging in for centuries, let's say about human nature, are we fundamentally good or fundamentally evil? Is this a false dichotomy? How's the balance achieved? And all these questions were all debated in ancient China. The hard question, the so-called hard problem in Western philosophy, what is consciousness? What's the mind-body problem and its solution? I mean, this was discussed in India 2,500 years ago. It was the only thing they were interested in, is the nature of consciousness. So this is not a gap. I think that what has happened in the West is a gap was produced because of various historical factors that gradually resulted in philosophy being withdrawn from society and tending to isolate itself within the ivory tower, especially second half of the 20th century. It began to retreat from everyday life and tackle questions of interest primarily to philosophers. So critics, had emerged. There always are people who come forward and say, but this is part of philosophy, but not the whole thing. But nonetheless, the tendency was to retreat from everyday life. And that's in the analytic tradition. In the continental tradition, they didn't do that. They went overboard in the other direction, postulating all kinds of crazy models, pretending to talk about reality, but they couldn't be further divorced from it than us. I mean, if you, again, with all due respect, if you look at the so-called leading continental philosophers, there's no European government talking to them. I mean, they have, Habermas could probably fill a hall with 1,500 people like this to talk about some theory of justice, but there's no government in the European Union that is interested or understands anything that he has to say. So they're also disconnected, just like there's no philosopher within 50 miles of the White House. I mean, they don't see any. We live in a culture of bread and circuses. Not too many philosophers are necessary. So I think that both European continentalism and Anglo-American analyticity, in one way or another, became less relevant to everyday life, and people began to view them as some kind of peculiar occupation for eggheads, which really had nothing to do with anybody else. And they have nobody but themselves to blame for this image. It's the wrong image. Because we've had throughout history, with that exception of time, there have been practitioners in every generation, and I could rattle off dozens of names of people. John Stuart Mill, the great utilitarian, the great champion of rights, of reform for women, of reform for, ending slavery, children's rights, all the wonderful. He was a parliamentarian. He served in the English Parliament. So he walked the walk. He just didn't write books. He actually engaged in public service with Bentham to try and reform many aspects of life. And he succeeded without violently overthrowing it like Marx wanted to, There have been many philosophers throughout history who have engaged in Bertrand Russell was a famous pacifist. He was arrested. He was trying to protest the excesses of World War I and the insanity of the slaughter, and they saw him as unpatriotic. He was, always, we are beacons to signal the problems of conformity and of mass culture conformity. Always philosophers stand up to be those beacons. Right? Cicero did it back in ancient Rome. He had his head chopped off for his trouble, and the wife of Antonia, she stuck a hat pin through his tongue. But that's only because they feared him, because his words were powerful. So you could go all the way through the history of philosophy and find in every generation philosophers who were actually engaged in some kind of amelioration of the human estate. They just were not only theorizing. They wrote important books, but they also acted on their principles.
And you are one of them. I mean,
On a good day.
On a good day. We need good days in life, right? But, I know, now you are expanding this APA, this Association for Philosophy Counselors, all over the world. I mean, you are out there in the world trying to bring philosophy to the world. What resistance did you have to fight against? I don't think it was all easy and good. I mean, what kind of fights you had behind your shoulders already?
Well, I like things not always to be easy. I wouldn't say that I demand that the world be difficult, but sometimes we need a little pushback in order to really evaluate our own mission, to be
Mhm.
clear in our own thoughts and deeds. If we meet with no resistance, then we'll have chaos. If nobody ever meets with resistance, it becomes just chaos because everybody does what they want, you know. I think that there are important norms, and cultural evolution mimics biological evolution. It's not the same, but there is a process that I call synthetic selection, which is analogous to natural selection. So
Okay.
ideas are tested.
Uh,
Inventions are tested, things that people do are tested, and things that withstand the test of time are definitely subject to different challenges.
mhm.
And important works of art or of politics or of philosophy which withstand the test of time and have some kind of survival value have characteristics which again mimic the viable species. So they have adaptability, they
Mm,
evolve, you know, they're
mhm.
applicable and so forth. But so, in my life, I've met with all kinds of impediments. But I think that for the benefit of people who are listening, it's really important to realize that impediments, that adversity sometimes is actually a very beneficial thing. Again, you know, might go back to Seneca. It's like the idea of the putting the iron in the fire to turn it into steel. You have to be tempered in life and be made better than you are. And life's circumstances can certainly help us to become stronger and to also, as I say, examine more carefully what it is that we believe and how we act on it. So specifically, I encountered problems as a graduate student
Mm.
because I wrote the thesis that I wanted to write.
Which was,
I didn't listen to anybody. I listened to my heart and my mind, and I wrote what I wanted to write. And my supervisor, he had my best interest at heart. And as the thing was taking shape, he was reading it chapter by chapter. And one day he said to me, he said two things. His one thing he said was, "You're never going to get a PhD for this. It's too much." So I said, "That's okay. I'd rather err on the side of too much than too little, and
okay.
I can always whittle it down later." And the other thing he said to me, which was very funny, is because he was English. I did this in England, and you know there's a great streak of Puritanism still in the culture. So you're not supposed to enjoy what you're doing. You're supposed to work very hard. You know, you're supposed to
Yeah.
really work hard, have a great work. You know, the Protestant work ethic. You're really supposed but you must not enjoy it. That would be a sin.
Uh-huh.
You know.
Otherwise, God doesn't love you.
No, that's right. So you have to really make every effort but never enjoy anything. It's a terrible torture. People subject themselves to this torture. It's not like that in the Catholic countries. Not that I'm a Catholic. I'd be a very bad Catholic too. But I mean, the Catholic countries at least have the confessional. So
Mhm.
you can have a wonderful time. You can enjoy it. You can make a lovely meal and enjoy it and then confess later, you know, and then wipe the slate clean. This is a very smart thing psychologically. It gives you a way to expiate your sins, and then you can go right back to sinning the next day. So it's not an accident that the best food in Europe is all from Catholic countries, Italy, Spain,
Oh,
France, you
yeah.
know, not an accident. And the best parties, too, right? The best fashion, the best art, you know, not the best philosophy always.
Enjoy
That's
life.
from the people who are in denial, you know, from the north. But definitely the worst food from so I mean I was encountering that obstruction and he was right. So anyway, he said to me one day, he said, "Now I know what the problem is with you."
Mm.
He said, "You love philosophy.
Uh-huh. That was a problem.
You're enjoying philosophy. You're enjoying this." I said, "Yeah, what's wrong with that? I mean, I'm devoting my life to it. I'm going into debt for this. If I didn't enjoy
Uh,
it, I'd be crazy, you know." So this is a question. Sometimes people enjoy too much, and those are the hedonists, right? They spoil themselves, ruin themselves by pursuit of pleasure above all else. That's a
yeah.
mistake. And sometimes
Right.
people deny too much and don't allow themselves to be who they are because there are external forces which want to prevent them, or live vicariously through them,
Ah,
or are afraid of them. So people have to have the courage, which is a practice. So anyway, the resolution of that problem was very simple, although time consuming. I wrote my first thesis to satisfy myself, and indeed I was satisfied with it, not my examiners. They made me write another one. So I wrote another one. It satisfied them. And I got two for the price of one. What's bad about that?
well, you certainly are a writer, but on two different topics or just the same
Yes, two
topic?
completely. And the
No.
first one, finally,
Uh,
what they told me to do was take this thesis, they said, and take a very, very tiny chunk of one of the
mm,
chapters
right.
and bore down, touch the bottom.
Mhm.
So I did that, and the thesis they eventually gave me credit for was a very detailed and in-depth computer simulation of prisoners' dilemma strategies and the evolution of
You.
families of successful strategies in computer mediated competitions to see what kind of characteristics were conducive to basically a superior performance in the prisoner's dilemma. Very interesting and challenging thing in game theory. So that's what they eventually gave me the PhD for. But the first thing that I wrote was a huge, vast work on the philosophical foundations of human conflict. And that was published last year, finally. I
Yeah,
actually,
I
I
saw
didn't
that.
wasn't
Okay,
didn't
yeah.
want to publish it, but
Yeah.
eventually they came after me, and publishers came after me, and they said, "You have something? You have something?" I've always got something, and they wanted to publish this. The
Yeah.
first thesis got published last year by
Ah,
Roman and Littlefield. It's called "On Human Conflict: The
mhm.
Philosophical Foundations of War and Peace." It's probably the most important book I've ever written, and it will have the smallest readership of any. Never, it won't be close.
No,
Oh,
no.
I'm furious because for one thing, they're charging a fortune. It's one of
Ah,
these
that's a problem.
academic books, and they won't make a cheap version. That's their model. So the textbook is like $130. The hardcover, is 100, and then the ebook I think is $5 less. But
Sure,
that's
the,
ridiculous because
the Russian pirate website.
so no one's going to buy this book because it's just too much money. I mean, there are actually it is selling, but it's not going to be it's not going to be particularly well read. It's my best work though.
And
So,
tell us more. What's the foundation? What's the thesis?
it's
What can you tell us about this book?
would you want to know?
Yeah, a little. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
what I
Maybe.
showed, it's really an existence theorem. I was not able to solve the problem of war,
Okay.
but what I was able to show in various ways is that there is no there's no mathematical or statistical likelihood or necessity, but there's no mathematical model that shows us that wars are going to happen or indeed are likely to happen. There's no causal necessity. So if you look at the etiology, the philosophy of
Mm.
causation, you will not see any causal necessity for war. If you look at the biological roots of conflict, and they go very deeply, it's now very fashionable to deny biology altogether. We have a radical anti-realist, anti-scientist wing that's basically brainwashing everybody. But in fact, we are products of evolution, and the biological aspects of conflict, not warfare, but conflict run very deep. But there is no biological imperative, I discovered, which
Mm.
dictates that we have to have wars. There are various excuses and pretexts. There are political pretexts and there are religious crusades. But these are cultural artifacts. They're not part of our biology.
Mhm.
And there is no overarching cultural program either that says, we have to have wars. And there is no systemic inevitability either. Because I looked at systems theory and there's a lot of literature there. So basically, it's a very long story, but the conclusion is that people make wars because they will to make war. At the end of the day, it's a question of people deciding that they want to do it or they need to do it, but they don't have to do it, and that means it's an existence theorem. So peace is possible under certain conditions. If problems are addressed in what I would call a sober way, in a sane way, not in a reflexive way, then it is possible to diminish the impact that armed conflict has had on our species and evolved, but the evolution required for this is neither biological nor cultural. I've shown that cultural evolution is necessary but not sufficient
Right.
for the cessation of armed conflict on a large scale. We need to have a third form of evolution, which I call psychic evolution. So evolution of the psyche. I'm not talking about phonopsychic again. I'm not talking about
Yeah.
that kind
I
of
don't
psychic.
think you were.
I mean,
Yeah.
evolution of the human psyche itself
Hmm.
is going to be the thing that will facilitate a greater promise of peace for the species as a whole. So it's a very complicated work, but I revealed things which uncovered things which have never been spoken of before. There are some discoveries in there. And I think the first review, it's only taking 2 years, but the first review is coming out supposedly very soon by Lydia Amir, a dear
Nice.
friend and colleague, and she's very brilliant in her own right. So she's undertaken a review of this book. But I can send you the link to that as
I
well
would
for
love
the
to.
intrepid souls who uh, who want to tackle maybe even one chapter of it. It might be instructive for them. So I overcame basically obstacles by essentially not regarding them as obstacles, but as challenges.
Hmm.
And I think that another big factor, Susie, is that people sometimes get in their own way and that obstacles are self created and we become our own impediments. And we need to remove the self obstructions inside
Hmm.
in order to be who we are. And philosophy can help with that too.
Yeah, and that's part of the psychic development also you
Yes.
were mentioning before. Do you think it has to do also with pleasure? I mean, you mentioned pleasure before and the need of people to refrain from pleasure because it's kind of a sin and so on. And so it seems that evolution has to be struggle and uh, worries and pain. How do we?
Well, people are going to be swayed by market forces. And so naturally, there are all kinds of so called quick escapes that are offered, but often they become addictions, whether they're licit or illicit. There is this, I mean, pain and pleasure are sovereign masters to a certain extent. Very few people will be really stoic enough to disregard them, or
Mhm.
Buddhist enough, or Taoist enough to regard them as imposters,
Mhm.
which to a certain extent they are, like success and failure. They're imposters, and we should not be too carried away, neither discouraged by failure nor blinded by success. It's very easy. Success is more dangerous in some ways, but pleasure is like that. We definitely require pleasure as human beings. It's something we probably have an instinct for. But remember, Freud was constantly juggling eros and thanatos. He was never sure that we have this appetite for life, and maybe we have an appetite for death, and he was never quite willing to relinquish that one. I think that Hobbes had a clearer
Yeah.
picture of us. I think people are basically craving something most of their lives, and it might be pleasure, it might be power, it might be whatever they deem to be good for themselves, but we're not always the best judges of that either. I would say to some of your younger people, and this will be not helpful to them, but they may remember it one day, that is the very best things that have happened to me in my life I did not really foresee or plan. I certainly took steps down particular roads. But what really came up on those roads and what I encountered, the really best things that I've encountered were not things that I myself had willed or even wished for. They just manifested. And I think that's very important. We're not in total control, in other words, although we have to control what we can. And among other things, I would definitely say for younger people, they ought to get their hedonistic impulses satisfied. It's a very good time of life to do it. Normal teenagers don't need Plato. They need music, and in our case, it was the 1960s. So
Oh, well.
we had the wonderful counterculture. We were hippies. We had sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and motorcycles, and rock concerts, and we had all this amazing stuff going on. And so we didn't need Plato. I think an appreciation for philosophy comes with a little more maturity in most cases. So certainly I began to appreciate Plato more and more as I matured. But I think that young people really need to grow
Mhm.
and they're growing so rapidly at that stage that they really need to experience, within relatively safe margins,
Mhm.
whatever pleasures life offers them, and do it safely and do it wisely. But don't deny yourself, because you don't want to have regrets later. That's
Yeah.
the best thing, is not to have regrets.
Mhm.
So sometimes you need to basically explore and seek what your impulses are telling you to seek, and that way you won't say, oh, if only I'd done this when I was 18, now it's too
Mhm.
late. You don't ever want to say that.
Yeah.
But what you can say is, if you do, and every decade, and people don't write about this, we have books on, endless books on developmental psychology for children, right?
Mhm.
And they keep moving the goalposts. But I mean, we always have this: children are being studied, and adolescents to a certain extent. We have a lot on adolescents, and then it stops, and then somehow it's assumed like, okay, now you're 21, like, and no more books for you. Now good luck. You're an adult. Go find your way. But it's not like that,
Mhm.
because the 20s are another stage, and the 30s are
Yeah,
another stage, and the 40s are another stage.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And people need different kind of guidance at different life stages. So philosophy becomes more and more useful, I believe, as people mature.
I agree with you. Yeah, it's a given that you have to get everything figured out within a certain age, but that hardly ever happens.
Ah, no, 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 no,
Yeah.
not anymore. Especially since, for those fortunate enough to have health care, and
Mhm.
medical science has doubled life expectancy in the last century. It's astonishing. Just imagine, as I was researching Fernando Sor, who lived in the early 19th century, I mean, life expectancy of a man during the Napoleonic Wars was reduced to under 30 years old. It
Wow.
wasn't much more than 30 anyway, maybe 40 before Napoleon, and for women, maybe 42. But that's that's very short.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
then when they were basically killing each other off in wars, and then you have famines and plagues and all the things that follow with war, so everyone's life is being shortened, and you ended up having people with a life expectancy of 30 years old, which is just so sad if you consider what can be accomplished in a fuller life. So
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to appreciate that the longer life goes, it's not just a question of quantity, that we need in every decade of our lives, or every phase, however you count them, to do the things that are qualitatively important for that phase in order to live a full life. And then the result is, we're not any longer talking about pleasure. We're talking about something that is less transient and more
Mhm.
enduring, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, or
Mhm.
fulfillment,
Mhm.
right? Or awakening, or something, whatever you want to call it. It is pleasurable, but the goal is not pleasure. It's a more indestructible form of happiness that does not depend on a mood, one day or the next. It does not depend on external circumstances from one minute to the next either. And that comes with a certain maturity. This is not something that most young people need to worry about.
Although it seems, especially when you reach the cycle of life, so you get your degree, then you have to find a job. So there's the end of a cycle, the beginning of a new one. You feel, at least that's what I gather from my students, right? You feel the heaviness of I have to start from scratch again. How can you reach, if you can, some kind of fulfillment, some kind of strength when you have to make the jump, right? When you finish your cycle of studies, you have to make a decision for your life, for your vocation. How was it for you? I mean,
This pressure to get a job, to have a career. Is that what you're
yeah,
talking about?
yeah,
Yeah, well, that's what most people feel. I never had that pressure, because I never wanted a job or a career.
yeah,
So I was able to avoid that problem. As you know, it's not going to help most of your listeners, but I would say you could always become a philosopher, and you don't have to worry about looking for work. But I mean, you understand what I'm saying, that basically some people know what they want to do from an early age,
Yeah.
and they do it whether they want to be an astronaut or a doctor or whatever they want to be, and they're fortunate in a way, or they have a gift, they have a musical gift or some other kind of gift, and this is what carries them, so they don't have this problem. But the majority of people have to make choices. So I would say, a good way to proceed in a kind of general way would be, if as undergraduate students or even as high school students, you should just pursue as many interests as possible to discover what you like and what you don't like. You have to be an empiricist. We don't always know what we want to do,
Mhm.
and we, people will make suggestions, but you have to in the end make a choice. So the choice should be well informed. It shouldn't be you choose this because your friends convinced you or your parents pushed you, but it should come from your own heart. And how you can help yourself is by taking a variety of electives, not over specializing too soon.
Mhm.
This is how I found out I don't want to be a medical doctor. I have many friends who are, and I'm glad they are, believe me. But I myself thought about it for a while. Oh, yeah, maybe that's a good thing, right? So I started to take the pre-med cycle and immediately discovered that I really didn't enjoy organic chemistry whatsoever. And then, even worse, biochemistry totally defeated me. I got into a lab and I had to make acetylsalicylic acid, and we spent 4 hours coming up with this white powder, and it was like 20% pure. I said, what is the point? I can buy it in a drugstore and it's pure, and I can do it now. I don't need to go to. So, to me, it was not a useful way for me to spend time. I didn't engage with it. So that helped me understand immediately that I'm not probably a good candidate to go to medical school, because these various studies which you need to build on are not things I enjoy doing. And this is how we discover, not by sitting in an armchair and pondering, but by attempting to do something. We discover what we are good at, what we want to be good at, what we perhaps don't have aptitude for and are really not interested in. So the job of education then is really important. It would be ideally to expose young people to a huge spectrum of possibilities and let them make choices and try things and experiment and see what they like. And that way they have a good chance of finding something which intrigues them, and maybe that resonates with them. So that's one thing, okay? Don't get pushed into a corner too soon in life.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I strongly agree. I didn't have this interest either. I mean, I didn't have money either to be a philosopher or to pursue a career in philosophy, but I decided, okay, that's what I want to do. So let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you didn't initially say, I want to be a philosopher.
Oh no, oh no. You know, I tried with philology and everybody was studying so hard. Everybody was on these books 24/7. And I can't. I'm not a good philologist. I wasn't up for studying that much, being that much on the books. I realized, yeah, can't be for me.
Well, there you go. But it's also a bit of like trial and error.
Yeah,
I
trial and
was not
error.
interested in philosophy
Mm.
for a long time, and I think I became a philosopher because I wanted to avoid having a career, initially at
Ah, I see.
least. I really, that people say I was born this way, so maybe it's a pre-existing condition. Maybe, well, being a philosopher is a kind of a personality disorder. Who knows, right?
Could
Of
be.
course, I'm joking with you, but.
I mean, was there any moment in life in which you worried about how people saw you, how people perceived you? I noticed
No,
that this is something recurring in new generations.
no, I'm sorry. No, that's
I
probably
know.
because of Facebook. Again, we didn't have this stuff. We didn't care. Basically, we had friends who accepted us for who we were, and each one of us was unique.
Uh,
And I want to say this, that we have today a terrible culture of conformity, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on people to conform, and a fear of being ostracized or being excluded or canceled if they don't. It's very rotten to the core. It's mean, and it makes people dysfunctional and less than human. It's dehumanizing, and it's absolutely intolerable. A better model was only about 3 months in the 60s when everybody trusted everybody. But in those days, we called each other freaks. And this was actually a term of approbation. This was it was a compliment, because to be a freak meant that you were an original person, It meant that you presented yourself in a totally unique way. Your dress, the way you dressed, the way you decorated yourself, your hairdo, the way just you walked down the street and you were unique, and people would look at you, and there was nobody like you, and everybody was therefore themselves and honest and sincere and authentic. That's what it meant to be a freak, and nobody was judging anybody by saying, "Oh, he's the wrong kind of freak," or "She's the wrong," she's not the right kind of freak. No, it's not possible to conform to freakdom, because by definition, a freak is individual. And we usually think of it as pejorative, like a freak of nature, or a freak storm, or a freak accident. Usually it has pejorative, negative connotations. But on the positive side, a freak is a unique human being, and therefore does not need or want to conform. And when you have a whole society of unique people, then all they're conforming to is, if you like, it's meta, they're conforming to being who they are. It's a much more wholesome way to be. But we didn't have to worry about Facebook or Twitter. So we were in a way freer, okay? Freer.
Yeah. And now there's, I don't know if you watched that movie. It comes to my mind now. It's out in the theater, I'm Your Man. Have you had a chance?
I'm sorry, I don't go to theaters anymore.
That's a pity.
But I could watch it. I mean, I don't spend much time watching movies. I'm probably missing out on some things. So thank you all. Put it on my do list, okay? But it's pretty far down. I like to produce more than consume.
I know. Well,
but in any case, I appreciate the suggestion. I mean, I'm mindful in other ways. I see it with my own students, and the issues that they bring up in class also are parallel to what you're talking about, or similar. So they have all kinds of pressures again. And so when we're younger, especially teenagers, maybe early 20s, then you have a circle of friends, and they're very important. They're really important. So you naturally want to find people who share your values or share your views and hang out with them, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's when our values are imposed on us by external forces that demand that we conform, then they will make it difficult for you to be who you are, and you may pay a price. You may wish outwardly to pay that price to belong, to be accepted by whoever, but in the end you may be denying something very individualistically important to you, and eventually it will express itself.
Yeah, which is the root of depression. When you lose the connection with yourself, then it's hard to find the energy again. And and then you sit there incapable of moving next. Look, was there a time in which you felt in a down, and you felt that you had to start from scratch, that there was that you didn't have so much energy, and nevertheless you had to restart, to had to keep things moving, or something?
Well, that's a slightly different question. I think that I've lived several lifetimes in this life, or several lives in this lifetime, so starting over is certainly not new to me. And in some sense, I like to think of every day as a new start. It makes me very happy to get up in the morning and have, this new day. It's like a blank slate where a lot of good things can happen. And that's something that I've developed a bit later in life. But listen, the truth is, Susie, that I've worked many kinds of jobs and many kinds of careers. I was a professional musician for a number of years and a teacher of music. I was an athlete.
Yeah, I read it.
Oh yes, I mean, I was definitely into many kinds of sports, and I played, high school and college sports. I didn't get drafted professionally, but I went on and studied martial arts for many years with a great master from China who came to the New World, and I've been a classical guitarist and a teacher and a performer of music and a recorder of music. I had a 10-year career as a musician, and then later in life I went back to school. Only around age 29 I went back to do a first degree in theoretical physics. I decided that I loved mathematics and had been neglecting it, so I went back to do that. That was a different life, and that led me to philosophy of science and a PhD, or two theses, philosophy of science. And then I had a different career, but in between there were salad days. At one point I ran out of grant money. I mean, you put together a succession of support to study, especially higher education. It's expensive. and not being wealthy and not having resources, I was dependent on scholarships, like many are. And eventually, I reached a point where I was not quite there. I had to write another thesis, and I had no money to support. So I went to the remote countryside, and I chopped wood and fished
Uh-huh.
and lived on in a grassroots economy, very far from civilization, and was extraordinarily productive there. And then I had another life, when I re-entered university as a lecturer and embarked on a career path. And then another life when Plato Not Prozac was published, 1999. I'll never forget the publicist from HarperCollins, this wonderful woman who took me to lunch one day just a few months before the publication, and we were discussing the tour. It was the old style book tour. Those things don't exist
Wow.
anymore, but
Oh.
in those
Mm,
days, there was a real book tour. It was a wonderful
mm.
experience. And she just looked at me and she said, your life is about to change, and really it did. It changed in a huge way. I had no inkling of it. And then it changed in other ways as a result of that change. Change brings change. So, I mean, looking back, I could see 5, 6 different kinds of careers, different kinds of stages of development, and each one was totally different from the previous one. So I had to really start at the beginning again and understand the way to go forward. But this is a wonderful opportunity. I never had what a lot of people have, which is a complaint that they're bored, or they're sick and tired of what they do, or they wish they could do something else, but they're living in a box and they don't know how to get out of the box. I was born outside the box, so I don't have this problem. But I understand for some people it takes maybe some daring or some courage or some belief
Mhm.
uh, in order to take that step they always really wanted to take. I remember a friend of my mother's who, at age 80, went back to do a BA in history because all her life this woman had really wanted to study history, and one way or another she just never got around to it. She had a whole long life already with family and all these and a career, and then at 80 years old she said, well, I better do it now.
Yeah.
And she went back to school. She got admitted.
Yeah.
So these were like, she was in a class with, I guess, what it must have been like her grandchildren or great grandchildren. And she finished her degree. She did a 4-year degree in history, and she was the
Oh,
proudest person you would ever see, graduating with her cap and gown and getting her degree in history. And this
okay.
was a real life fulfillment for her. So I think that people, who have unfulfilled ambitions really at some point need to bring them to light and say, look, if this is who I am and this is what makes me feel successful in life, I have a purpose, I have a mission,
Mm.
go for it. You don't have to go for all of them at once, but you have to go for them. You have to make your life worthwhile.
Well, thanks, Lou, for this burst of energy that you bring with us today. That's really a wonderful message to leave. I have just one final question, which is, the
I
clue.
don't believe you, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
This
I would
one,
stay
we
here
could,
for
this
hours.
could be a long conversation. It's very enjoyable, and
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for you, taking the time also to spend
Oh,
with me.
I am
But
grateful.
what's your quote unquote final question? I'm
Yeah,
curious.
the clue of this interview. What's the meaning of life for you? What do you get? Right? Is it a question that we can ask even? What is this?
Well, this wasn't on the list, so you.
I know. And
No,
nothing was on the list so far.
that's
We're
okay.
going.
We're both outside the box. I like the Zen master's answer to that.
Yeah,
A disciple asked him that question: "What's the meaning of life?" He said, "When I'm hungry, I eat, and when I'm tired, I sleep."
right. Mm-hmm.
So I don't mean to be trivial. It's not trivial. It's actually very profound. It's that everything is meaningful if you treat it as though it were meaningful. And I would say more importantly, if you want things to be meaningful, then live in the present moment, because every moment is meaningful. Every moment is magical if you can find that ordinary magic. One of my hobbies is photography. I love nature
Oh,
especially, and it's
uh-huh.
so beautiful, but there's always a shot. The whole thing is people spend hours walking around with a camera. You take 100 pictures, maybe you got one good one, right? The whole art is you usually have to take a lot of pictures to get the one that's really beautiful. But
Right.
actually, potentially every picture could be really beautiful. You have to see it. Every moment has something which we would call a beautiful picture. But the art then is, do we see it? Do we notice it? Do we capture it? Do we experience it? That's the meaning of life. Every moment has that magical picture, that beautiful instant where we kind of resonate with reality, and our egos are not in the picture. That's another thing. People will find that their egos will get in the way of that moment too. So the meaning is being really immersed in the sea of life and swimming, and just being very grateful that it's happening.
How can we keep our eyes open, you think? Because it's really hard.
What's that?
How can we keep our eyes open? It's really hard. I mean, you can keep it open for 10 minutes. I don't know. It's already long time. I don't know. How can we stay awake? What
Well, we can practice. If it's a virtue, if we're talking about something that is in any way a virtue, which I believe it is,
Mhm.
virtue of finding meaning in life, then making our lives meaningful, then I think that there are practices that conduce to being virtuous, and there are many. Whether they're Stoic practices of ascesis,
Okay.
the exercises they invented are very good for this. Quick example, or the
And
Buddhists. The Buddhists better than anybody, I think, in terms of explicitly giving us practices which help us to be appreciative and to experience that ordinary magic, as Chogyam Trungpa called it, or indeed the Taoists. The Taoists are the most poetic and the most mysterious, but they did very similar things. So, for example, I remember being in a traffic jam once in New Jersey. Well, it's not just once, but I mean, one day I was in a traffic jam in New Jersey, and I had to be somewhere. It was just not going to happen because it was a traffic jam. And okay, most people in a traffic jam experience a physiological change which is really hundreds of thousands of years old. Unfortunately, modern life does not always accommodate itself well to our hardwired fight or flight response.
right.
So when people are stuck in traffic, they experience it as stress.
Mhm.
And stress is, everybody is now living in stressful ways. You don't have to be in traffic for that. Stress has been induced by the culture. So this is a good thing for many people, whether they are in a traffic jam or not. They're stressed out, right? They say. So when you have stress, you have 12 physiological changes that take place, and they're all preparing your body either to fight or to run. That's the fight or flight response.
Right.
And unfortunately, being stuck in a traffic jam induces that physiological state. But you can't fight it because the traffic doesn't care. It's not going to. So people try and fight the traffic, but there's no reaction. Or you run. How can you escape? You escape the other way. The cops will pull you over. You made an illegal turn. You're going to get a ticket because they're waiting for people to try and escape from it, right? So they can ticket them. So you can't run and you can't fight. So what do? I looked out the window. And right now I'm looking out the window, and I'm seeing I'm in a traffic jam, and I'm going to be late. And I didn't have a cell phone in those days. I couldn't phone them and tell them anything. And I see a cemetery. It's right beside. There's a lot of cemeteries in New Jersey. Anyway, I saw a cemetery, and I did a cemetery meditation. I was no longer in traffic. I was looking at the cemetery and saying to myself, well, would I rather be here or would I rather be there? And obviously at the moment, I would rather be here. We're all going to be there one day. What's the rush? So cemetery meditation helps you.
Okay.
And there are many practices, the Stoics, the Buddhists, the Taoists, they all do cemetery meditations
Okay.
because they are that way going to be way more appreciative of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we're all going to be there one day, and so now we're in this mode of being conscious and engaged, and the proper response, I think, is to be deeply appreciative for the opportunity to be in life.
Mm-hmm.
And why waste it? So
Yeah.
that gives us tremendous meaning. Just the fact that we don't take it for granted. The bottom line is, why would you take anything for granted? It's a gift. It's a great gift. And how do you respond to being given a gift? Usually with thankfulness, with gratitude, isn't it nice to be appreciated and to receive? Well, if you're alive, Susie, and you're walking around as a living being, then you've been given the gift of life. You don't even need to know who the giver is, whether the giver is God or evolution or both or neither. It doesn't matter. You have this wonderful gift, and if you can express appreciation for this gift, then your life has tremendous meaning already.
Yeah. Look, what can I say? I'm incredibly thankful for this conversation we had together and for the time you dedicated to us. You're a remarkable person and incredibly pleasant to talk to. I hope the message, any message, anything can arrive beyond this talk and stay with us. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you. I think you're doing a wonderful thing with the podcast, and I hope that our audience will find something interesting in there.